Sonic the Hedgehog becoming Super Sonic and the whole experience of playing my Sega Genesis as a little kid would become synonymous to not only my childhood, but that of many 90s kids. So imagine my surprise a few years later when I discovered Dragon Ball Z and I found a character, Goku, who would attain a new level of power and show it by having his hair spike up and turn golden, just like my hero Sonic. So naturally, seeing this connection as a little kid, I wanted to know more and thus began my lifelong obsession / fandom with Dragon Ball. And it's all because of Sonic. So now, many years since those times, as a grown man and now as a lifelong fan of both Sonic and Dragon Ball, wouldn't it be great to go back and look at some of the comparisons, some of the homages and influences that Sonic has taken from Dragon Ball, or maybe some things that Dragon Ball has borrowed from Sonic as well. Let's talk about it on this speedy edition of Dragon Ball In Depth.
この放送はご覧のスポンサーの提供でお送りします。
Now, I love Sonic the Hedgehog and I love Dragon Ball, and there are so many connections between the two that it's not even funny, which is probably why I love both of them. So, in order to really get a good grasp of where the connections came from, we're going to have to go back to the beginning. Development for Sonic the Hedgehog began around April of 1990 after the failure of the previous mascot, Alex Kidd, and the need for Sega to compete with Nintendo's Mario. Sonic was going to be their mascot. Sonic first debuted on June 23, 1991 with the Sega Genesis launch title called Sonic the Hedgehog, the very first one, in America, otherwise known as the Mega Drive in Japan and other parts of the world. Now, during this time, Dragon Ball, the manga, was serialized in Weekly Shonen Jump and was extremely successful, and right around this time, Toriyama's story had reached the Namek Saga, featuring the introduction of Frieza and many elements that would become staples of the franchise for years to come. Now, I personally love the first Sonic game. Amazing music, amazing level design, great characters, great bosses, hard as hell, but there weren't that many Dragon Ball influences. The one thing that I think people always go to is the Chaos Emeralds. But remember, in Sonic 1, there were only 6 Chaos Emeralds. It wasn't until Sonic 2 that introduced the 7th Chaos Emerald, which would match up with the 7 Dragon Balls. But there is one thing that you can say may have been influenced by Dragon Ball, and that is, of course, Eggman's comparisons to Frieza. They both have a very similar hovercraft. I mean, almost identical, and they both have a giant empire, and they both have servants underneath them. But that might not be enough evidence. However, it is interesting that Eggman was a crazy scientist, and Dragon Ball would not introduce the concept of a mad scientist who wanted to kill Goku until the artificial human arc. So Sonic did do that first. Now, when we get to Sonic the Hedgehog 2, that's where we see the big parallels between Dragon Ball and Sonic, and the influences really come out. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for Sega Genesis was released November 24th, 1992, otherwise known as Sonic Tuesday. In this game, the Chaos Emeralds went from 6 to 7, and Sonic had now learned the ability to become Super Sonic if all the emeralds were obtained. His fur would become golden yellow, his quills would stick up, he's unbeatable, he can levitate, he can move fast, his muscle mass increases. I mean, he's pretty much just a beast as Super Sonic. Now, that game came out in November of 92. Goku's first appearance with the golden hair was March 19th, 1991 in Weekly Shonen Jump, over a year before Super Sonic would appear, and the programmers at Sega would take note. Now, when it comes to personality when comparing Son Goku to Sonic, they do have a few similar traits, but they're pretty different But you have to also remember that Sonic has been changed and retconned several times in various forms of media. Because Toriyama pretty much wrote the entire manga, Goku's character changes are not as drastic as Sonic's. Obviously, in the 90s, Sonic had much more of a cocky attitude in both American and Japanese markets, and he was more of kind of a smartass. Goku never really was that way, even though he has had times of overconfidence. What they do have in common, besides of course being these great heroes that we all love, is that they both have desires for more. Goku wants to fight stronger guys and get stronger, and Sonic, just as much of a thrill seeker as Goku, wants to explore new places. Now, as far as their overall looks and transformations, there have been some changes throughout the years that should be noted, starting with Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Super Sonic's eyes turned green, whereas in Sonic 2, his eyes were black, very similar to Goku in his transformed state. It should be also noted that in Sonic and Knuckles credits, Super Sonic's end pose kept his eyes black rather than green. Same thing with Hypersonic. But Sonic 3 does have the green eyes. Now, one very interesting factoid is that with Sonic Adventure, the first modern Sonic game, Super Sonic had red eyes, and coincidentally enough, there was some early concept art from Toriyama who drew Goku with red eyes. So that's very interesting, but I'm going to call that more of a coincidence. Now, with Sonic 3, there are a few more things that I feel were taken right from Dragon Ball. First of all, the special stages in Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles were inspired from Goku running around and chasing bubbles on Kaio-sama's planets. When you lock Sonic 3 with Sonic and Knuckles to play the complete version, Sonic 3 and Knuckles, the Super Emeralds are now introduced after you get the original 7 Chaos Emeralds. Of course, these Super Emeralds are bigger and stronger, much like the Namekian Dragon Balls. But the one thing that the Super Emeralds give you is the ability to unlock hyper forms like Hypersonic and Hyper Knuckles. These have often been compared to SS2, but when it comes to the way they look, it's very different. Sonic has flashing colors of different Chaos Emeralds, and Hyper Knuckles looks like Super Knuckles, but just with, shadows behind him and things like that. So even though Knuckles and Tails both have super forms, they don't really resemble Dragon Ball Z, whereas Sonic's original supersonic form was definitely without question taken from Goku. Outside of just Sonic himself, let's talk about some of the other characters in both Sonic and Dragon Ball that have obvious connections. Even though Tails is not Sonic the Hedgehog's son, a lot of people have compared him to Gohan, mostly because he seems to be just a younger kind of sidekick, but I never really saw Gohan as Goku's sidekick, and Gohan really comes off like more of a main character with his own arc, and he rages out and things like that, so I don't really see a comparison there between them. However, Knuckles, I think, is quite similar to Piccolo. A lot of people have said he's like Vegeta, but we have another character coming up later that I think is way more like Vegeta. Piccolo, however, fits with Knuckles. They both started out as villains, but they quickly warmed up to the protagonist through a common enemy, of course Eggman in this case. Now in Dragon Ball though, Piccolo would bond with Gohan versus Goku. In this case though, it's still kind of a similar thing. Not to mention that Knuckles is the guardian of the Master Emerald, which could be compared to Kami being the guardian of Earth in a floating platform, kind of like where the Master Emerald is, on an island floating in the sky. So there's little things here and there. Now the big one is Shadow the Hedgehog. Shadow the Hedgehog has been compared to Vegeta, and really, it's kind of a clear comparison. Although he's not quite as arrogant as the Prince, he's still Sonic's rival, he's a little bit stubborn, and has a lot of pride. He's also a hedgehog, just like Sonic. And he also has a super form, which doesn't look quite like Supersonic, but it's still a super form. Now, the other big one that I think is obvious is Silver the Hedgehog, which is basically Sonic the Hedgehog's version of future Trunks. They both come from the future to a different timeline to fix the timeline and make it so that it's not going to be the same as their future. And it's even stated in the design documents for Sonic 2006 that there is a similarity there. Now, Silver's main contribution was with 2006's Sonic the Hedgehog title, otherwise known as Sonic 06. Without going into too many spoilers here, there's a part in the video game where you have to go back to destroy a villain in its infant stage, which is very similar to when Trunks destroyed Cell in his larva/baby form, preventing him from being created in the current timeline. That's just one thing. But speaking of Cell, you want to talk about Cell, go back to Sonic Adventure. The main villain is this creature named Chaos, who requires all 7 Chaos Emeralds to reach his final form, known as Perfect Chaos. Where have I heard that before? And ironically enough, as Chaos absorbs these emeralds, his forms start changing, similar to what Cell was. Speaking of transformations though, what about Goku being able to become a great ape? Has that ever been in Sonic? Well, not exactly, but there is a bit of a trope when it comes to this. Specifically in Sonic Unleashed, Sonic becomes a beast known as the Werehog at night, which does sound a bit like the transformation at the full moon. However, in this case, you could just say it's more of a werewolf kind of influence than just Dragon Ball, which also got its idea from werewolves. And what about the Deadly Six? Are they similar to the Ginyu Force? They all have their own unique powers and colors and whatnot, and they both work for their leader, Frieza, or in this case, Eggman. However, the difference is that Eggman was forcefully controlling them, whereas the Ginyu Force were voluntarily and fiercely loyal to Frieza. But sometimes these influences go beyond just the video games. Now, I don't know if I have time to look into every single Sonic comic and every single piece of Sonic merch because there's so much out there that I could do 10 videos on it, but the one that I think sticks out to me huge was in Sonic X Episode 2, Sonic has a scouter called the Infrared Scope. It's a freaking scouter, dude. It's the same thing. And in Sonic Riders, Tails has what's called the Emerald Radar, which is like the Dragon Radar to find the emeralds, like the Dragon Radar finds Dragon Balls. It's like the same thing. Now, what about Goku Black? The evil version of Goku. Have there ever been any evil versions of Sonic? Well, Sonic did it first. Metal Sonic, Silver Sonic, Mecha Sonic, all of these falls into the category of evil versions of Sonic, and I guess the most notable version in Dragon Ball would probably be Turles from the third Dragon Ball Z movie, which was way before Goku Black. I'm sure there are tons more comparisons that I'm missing, but those seem to be the big ones that pop out at me. Now, is there anything that may have influenced Dragon Ball from Sonic? I got a couple of ideas. Let's talk about it. So for the majority of this video, I have outlined a lot of the possible influences, and some more than possible, that Sonic has taken from Dragon Ball. But is there anything in Sonic that predates Dragon Ball? Well, I already mentioned the fact that they had an evil scientist antagonist first, but there's a few more things when it comes to the more recent Dragon Ball material that may have been influenced from Sonic. In Sonic Rush, which came out in 2005, there's a character named Blaze the Cat with their own Chaos Emeralds known as the Soul Emeralds from another dimension. Blaze can obtain a power called Burning Blaze. In this form, Burning Blaze is pink and has an aura of fire, very similar to Goku's God power with the fiery aura and reddish magenta hair seen in 2013's Battle of Gods. Sonic did it 11 years earlier. Also, without going into spoilers, the future Trunks arc may have borrowed a few things from Sonic and specifically Silver the Hedgehog story, namely a timeline being completely erased and two villains fusing into one like Goku Black and Zamasu, but I don't want to go into detail for those of you who want to actually play the game and not be spoiled, but I can kind of see a little bit of the influence there. Again, it could be a coincidence, but I think that it's still worth mentioning. So I really hope you liked this video, and regardless of whether you started off as a Sonic fan and became a Dragon Ball fan or vice versa, no matter if you like classic Sonic or modern Sonic or whatever your choices are, there's no question that these two franchises have a rich history of connection, and I think it's okay to love them both because, well, I do. Before I close out, I want to give a very, very special thanks to two people who helped me create this video. They helped co-write the video. I want to first give a shout out to Moogie. Check out his channel. I'll leave a link down below. He covers tons and tons of Sonic stuff, including custom animations. And I want to give a shout out to Karai Jinx from Portugal. Check out his Twitter and his DeviantArt. Huge members of the Sonic community. Thank you so very much, and thank all of you for watching. And I assure you that if I'm wearing my speed shoes, I will catch you down that road.